Very few places in Beleriand survived the War of Wrath and the subsequent sinking of the entire region. There were the small islands of Tol Morwen and Himring, but there was a larger island called Tol Fuin. Tol Fuin was a large remnant of the central highlands that dominated Beleriand. A land where heroes were made, a land where tragedies took place, a land that was defended to the last and would serve as a grim spoiler for what may have happened to the rest of Middle-earth. In this video, we talk about Dorthonion, the central front against Morgoth. If you look at a map of Beleriand, you can see the large region of Dorthonion in the centre north. On this map, the larger font says Tal Nu Fuin, which was a later name for the region. Dorthonion is almost a perfect rectangle. In the west, it ends at the encircling mountains around Gondolin. In the north, it ends at the plains of Ardgallen or Anfalglyph. In the east, it ends at the plains of Lothlan. And in the south, it ends at the mountains known as Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror. There were two named subregions of Dorthonion. In the northeast was the land of Ladros, which you can see on the map. There was also a land called Drun, just to the west of Ladros, but it is not featured on the main map of the Silmarillion. As you can also see on the map, Dorthonion was a hilly region, specifically being described as highlands. In the north and west, the region was heavily forested by pines. These were the lowlands of Dorthonion. As one ventured south, the slopes would rise, and the land would become more barren until it reached the terrifying cliffs of Ered Gorgoroth. There were some other points of interest. Two rivers had their sources in Dorthonion, the Rivil, which fell down into the Fen of Serek, and the Mindeb, which travelled south towards Doriath. In the south of Dorthonion was the Pass of Anak, and taking that would lead you down to either the plain of Dimbar or the valley of Nandungatheb. Near Ladros was the beautiful lake of Eluin, and in the centre of the region was a high peak only known as Foen. Dorthonion's history begins with the Battle of the Powers, when the Valar decided to attack Morgoth in an effort to keep the elves safe. It's said that the northern highlands of Beleriand, specifically Dorthonion and Hiflum, were razed during the cataclysms of that war. The only noteworthy things about Dorthonion's early history is that it was visited by Melian the Maya when she ventured to Middle-earth, and she's said to have blessed the lake of Eluin. Another interesting visitor was Treebeard, who says to Merry and Pippin that he used to travel to the pine forests in the highlands of Dorthonion during the winter. During the years of the trees, Sindar elves spread out across all of Beleriand, with Thingol's kingdom of Doriath in the centre. They lived in East and West Beleriand, and in the regions of Hithlum and Nevras to the north. However, I couldn't find any mention of Sindar elves dwelling in Dorthonion. I'm not sure why, because at this time, Dorthonion, while wild, was still uncorrupted. The only possible explanations I have is that the Ered Gorgoroth and the Ikoriath were seen as too troublesome a barrier, or that the region was considered to be too close to the ruins of Angband and not sufficiently protected. In the end, the first permanent residents in Dorthonion, or rather in close proximity of Dorthonion, ended up being of the monstrous kind. After she was betrayed by Morgoth, Ungoliant made her residence in Nandungatheb, the valley beneath the cliffs of Ered Gorgoroth, turning it into a place of death and terror. She didn't stay there long, but she did leave behind her terrible legacy. A brood of giant spiders poisoned the land, and made the passage south of Dorthonion dangerous at the best of times. When the Noldor arrived in Beleriand in their pursuit of Morgoth, they found geography that was suitable to them. From the Great Sea in the west to the Blue Mountains in the east, there was almost an unbroken chain of hills and mountains that could help protect Beleriand from any potential incursions from Angband. In this bulwark, Dorthonion was right at the centre, directly across from Angband, thus it would need to be defended. This charge fell upon Angrod and Aegnor, the second and third sons of Finarfin and the younger brothers of Finrod Felagund. This was an unenviable position for the sons of Finarfin. Despite how it may look on the map, Dorthonion was far from impenetrable. The northern hills rose gently from the plains, so they weren't much of a barrier against any force that was attacking from the north. It would have been better if Dorthonion's geography was reversed, because Ered Gorgoroth had sheer cliffs that were actually impenetrable. Dorthonion wasn't just one of the weak points in the defense, it was also incredibly strategically important. If an enemy occupied Dorthonion, they could attack both the passes of Sirion and Aglon far easier, and controlling Dorthonion would allow for the controlling of the Pass of Anak, which provided direct access to central Beleriand, and would allow one to completely bypass both the defences in the east and west. So Dorthonion was a juicy target, and the people of the Sons of Finarfin knew it. so most chose to follow Finrod to Nargothrond, leaving only a minority defend the northern slopes. But make no mistake, these were considered some of the hardiest of the Noldor. The first test would come in the year 60 of the First Age. Believing that the Noldor had lapsed in their vigilance, Morgoth launched a surprise assault from Angband. The main army attacked Dorthonion, while smaller forces managed to break through Maglor's Gap and the Pass of Sirion and raid into Beleriand. Unfortunately for Morgoth, neither Fingolfin in the west or Maedhros in the east were unprepared. They gathered their armies and smashed into Morgoth's forces as they assailed the highlands. The orcs were routed and driven back to Angband, but before reaching the gates, they were surrounded and slaughtered to the last. This made the Noldor realise that stronger measures were required. Morgoth's forces could cross Ardgallen fairly quickly, and expecting Dorthonion to hold out every time until help arrived was a tall order, so the Noldor devised the Siege of Angband, a series of camps, forts, and patrols that came nearly to the gates of Angband itself. For the Noldor in Dorthonion, this may have provided some relief. They were no longer the first line of defence, and would not be taken by surprise should the enemy erupt from Angband again. While there were 2 attempts by Morgoth to break the siege, well, technically one, the other attempt was Glaurung going rogue, battle did not reach Dorthonion in either of these attempts. Another positive for Angrod and Egnor was that they soon received reinforcements. In 310, the first men arrive in Beleriand, the House of Beor, and they are discovered by Finrod Felagund. Because of this, Finrod strikes up a friendship with Beor, and soon the entire house is loyal to the House of Finarfin. Although the Beorians dwelt in Estelad in the south for many years, in 410 of the First Age they are given the land of Ladros in the northeast of Dorthonion to rule as a fief under the overlordship of King Finrod. Boromir is the first lord of Ladros, and while the Beorians never numbered as many as their Hadorian kin, their numbers were a welcome boost to the defences of the north. Unfortunately for the men of the House of Beor, they would not get to enjoy their new land for long. In 455, Morgoth launches his long-awaited assault, the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Rivers of lava erupt from the mountains of Thangorodrim above Angband, and the siege goes up in smoke. Literally. A few survivors reach the highlands of Dorthonion, where the lava is stopped, but not before it sets alight the pine forests along the northern slopes. The smoke obscures the vision of the defenders, allowing for Morgoth's vast armies to cross the plain of Anthalglyph, the Gasping Dust, completely unassailed. This is a broad front assault by Morgoth. He attacks Dorthonion, but also the mountains of Eredwethren to the west and the March of Maedhros in the east. Their allies do try to save them. The armies of Hithlum do attempt to cross the plains, and an army from Nargothrond, led by Finrod, races through the Pass of Sirion. Neither attempt is successful. The armies of Hithlum are driven back with heavy losses, and Finrod and his vanguard are cut off and surrounded near the Fen of Serech. In the end, Angrod and Egnor are killed, and besides them falls Bregalas, the Lord of Ladros, with many of his warriors. Those who survive manage to the southeast, and end up helping Maedhros hold Himring against Morgoth's forces there. But amidst all of the carnage, there is one glimmer of hope. I mentioned just before that Finrod was cut off. He would have been killed or taken captive, if not for the heroics of men. While things were going poorly in eastern Dorthonion, in the west, Barahir, the younger brother of Bregalas, was involved in fighting near the Pass of Sirion. Seeing that Finrod was in trouble, Barahir led the bravest of his men down from the hills, cut a path through to the beleaguered king, and got him to safety. As a reward, Finrod gave Barahir a ring, the legendary Ring of Barahir, and swore an oath of friendship to him and all of his kin. While the Dagor Bragollach ended the following year, a major loss for the elves and the Edain, the Battle of Dorthonion was just beginning. The people of Angrod and Egnor had been killed or fled, and while most of the House of Beor immediately fled to Hithlum, some weren't going to give up their lands that easily. Thus, Dorthonion became the subject of Morgoth's worst enchantments. The northern forests were corrupted beyond recognition. Then Morgoth pursued his people to the death, until few remained, and all the forest of the northward slopes of that land was turned little by little into a region of such dread and dark enchantment that even the orcs would not enter it unless need drove them, and it was called Delduaf, and Tal Nu Fuin, the forest under Nightshade. The trees that grew there after the burning were black and grim, and their roots were tangled, groping in the dark like claws, and those who strayed among them became lost and blind, and were strangled or pursued to madness by phantoms of terror. It was so bad that not even a year had passed before those that remained realised their struggle was futile. Imeldir, the man-hearted, the wife of Barahir, gathered up the remaining women and children and led them by dark paths to the forest of Brethil. Some, such as Morwen, the future wife of Hurin, went to Dorthonion. The remaining men fought on, but one by one, they were slain until at one point only 12 remained. Among them were Belagund and Baragund, Barahir's nephews, and most importantly, Beren, Barahir's son. These 12 were an elite band. Withdrawing to a secret lair near Lake Eluin, they hindered Morgoth's forces wherever they could, and news of their deeds eventually spread throughout Beleriand. This pissed off Morgoth so badly that he decided to send none other than Sauron to deal with them. Sauron had immediate success. He captured one of the outlaws, Gorlim, and tricked him into revealing the location of the secret hideout. Barahir's outlaws were ambushed, and all were slain, except for Beren, who was away at the time. Unfortunately for Morgoth, this did not solve the problem because Beren proved to be even more annoying by himself. It got so bad that Morgoth deployed an entire army against him, which included some of Sauron's werewolves, and placed a bounty on his head equal only to that of High King Fingon's. It was not just the mounting pressure that caused Beren to eventually abandon his homeland, it was that his homeland was turning against him. The corruption had spread deep throughout the highlands, and all clean things were departing the land for safer grounds. At last, in 464, Beren fled as well. The heroic deeds of Beren would have one final impact upon Dorthonion. Him taking a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown was a humiliation for the Dark Lord, and proved to his enemies that he was vulnerable. In 468, the Union of Maedhros was formed, an alliance mainly consisting of Hithlum and the Feanorians that had the goal of reinstating the Siege of Angband. Throughout that year and the following year, a series of counterattacks were launched across all of Beleriand, and even Dorthonion was retaken and cleansed of evil creatures, although the corruption would take longer to heal. Eventually though, elves and men would be able to return and live once again in the Highlands. Or at least they would have, if things had not gone horribly wrong afterwards. In 472, the Neneath Anoidiad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, took place, and it was a crushing defeat for elves and men. The only role that Dorthonion played in the battle was that a beacon was supposed to be fired there, to signal Fingon's army to attack, but this signal was never fired because the battle plans immediately went awry. In the aftermath of the battle, Dorthonion, as well as the entire northern frontier, were lost to Morgoth's forces, and they would not be reclaimed. Morgoth's forces became deeply entrenched there, and built a road through the pass of Anak, which they used to attack Doriath's territory south of the Ered Gorgoroth. By using this road and pass, they would eventually overrun the plain of Dimbar north of the forest by the early 480s. Using the same road, the Orcs would attempt to carry a captive Turin Tirambar back to Angband, and thus Dorthonion would be the site of another major tragedy. Beleg Strongbow would be accidentally slain by his friend while rescuing him. Dorthonion was probably also used as the staging ground for the assault on Gondolin, as Morgoth's army crossed the encircling mountains from the north. Unfortunately, there's no real mentions of Dorthonion after that. It's possible that it became a battleground during the War of Wrath, but if it did, it survived remarkably intact compared to the rest of Beleriand, where entire rivers and mountain ranges were destroyed. And as I said at the start of this video, the inner highlands of Dorthonion were one of the few places that actually survived the war and the sinking afterwards. And so Dorthonion became Tol Fuin, the Dark Island. Unfortunately, we know pretty much nothing about it. There's a good chance it was visited by the elves and the Númenóreans because it really wasn't far from Lindon, but there is no mention of any permanent residence there. One thing I theorized on another video of mine is that Tol Fuin became home to the spiders who dwelt in Nandungatheb and survived the War of Wrath. That would make Tol Fuin one of the most awful places in the world, but I will point out there's no evidence for this. It was probably just an empty island, filled with pine trees and painful memories of the Elder Days. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I think Dorthonion is one of the most interesting places in Beleriand because so much goes on there, and you can really see how important the region is during the back and forth struggle between the Battle of Sudden Flame and the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Also, I love how literally 12 dudes, and then just one dude, was able to contest the region for another 9 years after it was technically lost. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Dorthonion and Mirkwood shared the same Sindarin names after they were corrupted, which proves that Tolkien was a fraud.